Let's bring in Hollywood divorce attorney David Glass for more on this. David?
People going through divorces are going through some of the hardest times of their lives, and a lot of what they're going through is emotional. And in any divorce, there's a huge sense of loss, and loss of relationship, of money, some friends.
David Glass here for another new episode of the Hourglass Podcast, where family law and psychology intersect. I'm a certified family law specialist, former psychologist, and the author of Moving On, Redesigning Your Emotional, Financial, and Social Life After Divorce. Our mission is to do all we can to help those going through a breakup or divorce find ways to make the trauma of it all a little bit easier, more understandable, smoother, and to help people find the motivation and inspiration to move on. Today, I'm pleased to welcome attorney Michele Anderson. Michele has been a prosecutor and trial attorney since 1991. She sits on many boards affiliated with the legal community and is the past chair of the LA County Bar Association's Criminal Justice Section. She has many areas of legal expertise, chief among them domestic violence. Michele is also very active in community programs with nonprofit organizations and speaks regularly on voter registration, civil rights, constitutional rights. She conducts forums on a variety of issues affecting minority underserved communities. I have lots of questions for you today, Michele. But first, tell me, did I leave out anything about your background?
I think you covered it pretty well.
Okay, great. So first of all, is domestic violence on the increase these days?
I would say it definitely is. According to the National Coalition of Advocates for Domestic Violence, there's about 10 million cases of domestic violence annually. And so to sum that up, that's every 20 minutes, somebody is a victim of domestic violence. And that increase is multiplied by, I guess, from statistics that have been tracked from 2016 to 2018, it's like 46% increase in domestic violence.
And is there any literature or research trying to explain why there's been such an increase in domestic violence?
Well, I think one of the reasons why there's an increase in it is that there is more awareness and people are more willing to report and come out and say what is happening. This is no longer a family secret or something that should be kept inside. People, co-workers, employers are now more conscious and are more vigilant and notice things about their employees and their staff mates. But I think the other issue is that whenever we have situations environmentally, economically, even the weather changing, you will see an increase in domestic violence. I think the pandemic is a prime example. People were cooped up in their houses, so more time together. Children were having to be homeschooled, increasing the tensions in the household. Parents were laid off, so there was more tension because there's not enough money. Not enough services being rendered, so more stress on the household. Not enough food, not enough gasoline, not enough resources to come up with a little recipe that equals a time bomb in someone that is particularly sensitive or doesn't have the tools to control their behavior.
Right, and with domestic violence, what does it take in a case in order to get it to a criminal trial, as opposed to having it solved some other way, as a misdemeanor or having it solved in family court? Is there something unique about the cases that actually get all the way to a criminal trial?
Well, first and foremost, as a prosecutor and law enforcement, nobody really wants to tear apart a family. Nobody wants to create separation, children being taken away, mothers at risk, and those sorts of things. So the first shot that a prosecutor tries to do is see, okay, first of all, how serious were the injuries? What did the defendant's record look like? Has he done this before? Has he been into any type of counseling? Was alcohol or drugs involved? What is the dynamic that created the situation? Is it all about power and control? Because a lot of times in domestic violence, that is the foremost and most important situation, is power and control over the other party. So when you look at those factors and you look at the arrest, you try to see whether or not this person would benefit from counseling, or if it's not a serious injury, whether or not a diversion program or something less severe than jail time. However, if the parties are not in a situation where there is cooperation, where there is understanding, where there's quick intervention, we generally, as prosecutors, require, as part of our negotiating package, that the subject go through counseling. They call it domestic violence counseling. This is different than anger management.
Right.
It's domestic violence counseling to understand why, the different dynamics in the relationship, and to understand why you're behaving the way you're behaving, and how to interrupt that cycle of violence so that it doesn't occur again.
And how does it work with essentially legally forcing someone into counseling? I'm a former therapist, and sort of we always were taught you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. And so the person has to want to go to counseling. How does that play in with legal consequences sending people through counseling?
Part of that, I believe, is true. I also have done work in the area of drug recognition. And sometimes forcing a person into treatment is the only way they can get into treatment. Mm-hmm. And so to a certain extent, holding a person accountable, making them go to that domestic violence counseling, even if they don't want to participate, their counselor is going to be keeping notes, is going to be keeping stats on how many times they showed up and didn't show up. And they have to present that to the court. And if their conduct is not acceptable, and if they have not done what they are supposed to do, then it's a probation violation, and they can be subjected to more time and other penalties. So I do believe that you can force a person into treatment and can force a person into recognizing their shortfalls. However, I think people do need to want to be helped. Mm-hmm. And, there's a lot to be said about the child who witnesses domestic violence and then grows up to be an abuser himself or herself, because that's what they grew up with and that's what they saw as normal. And they may see it as that's what the roles are supposed to be. I have this feeling that that's how a man is supposed to act, and don't know until they are taught that this is wrong and it's not your property. A lot of foreign individuals believe that their wives or their husbands are their property, right, and therefore they can do whatever. And so you will actually see it in a police report where the subject says, "That's okay, officer, don't worry, she's my wife." Right. And the officer's saying, "You can't do that." Right. And they're shocked.
Yeah.
That they're in trouble for doing this. So it's It's a sad state of affairs.
What can a victim do to further protect him or herself after making that first domestic violence report, after first calling the police and getting some sort of intervention? Are there things they can do to further protect themselves?
Well, the thing to do is to make sure they have a plan. So often, victims will call the police right after an incident has happened, but then they fall back into the situation because of fear of not being able to support themselves, because of fear of not knowing what's going to happen with the children or the household or other material things. And so a lot of times they need to get hooked up with counseling services. They may need to get other services to help them become self-sufficient so that they don't have to rely on their abuser. Many a times women will return back to their abuser because they don't have any resources. They don't have a job. They don't make enough money to support the children, and so they'll just be quiet and go back into the situation in order to raise their family.
And then, along those same lines, what kind of advice could you give to a domestic violence victim after the criminal case has resolved itself? And so now the criminal justice system is largely uninvolved other than in monitoring the abuser. What kind of advice could you give to the victims?
Well, the first thing is to always be proactive about your situation. A lot of victims receive criminal protective orders or civil restraining orders in order to have to keep the perpetrator away from them. Understanding that these are great tools for law enforcement, but they need to also understand it's only a piece of paper. And if a perpetrator is coming for you and you see that person coming for you, you need to call 911. You need to get out of Dodge. You need to find safety because it's a piece of paper. And a person who's willing to break the law will hurt you, will kill you, and does not care if you have that piece of paper. However, if you see that person on your street and you know and you have enough time, you can call the police and they can intervene and remove that person before you are attacked. But victims of domestic violence need to have a plan. They need to know where they can go if they need to get to a safe house. There are resources. They can call victim advocates. They can contact the city attorney's office or the district attorney's office to get a hold of that. Also, they can find out from VINE, V-I-N-E, it's an organization that will let you call and find out whether or not your abuser has been let out of custody. That's helpful so that you are on the alert and know whether or not you are in danger. You can also check the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department inmate list and find out the status of a particular inmate by checking that and finding out. If you register with these services and everything, you will get notified if your perpetrator is being released. But like I said, you need to have a backup plan. You need to have a place where you can go. The shelters are secret. They are not published. You contact a victim's advocate. They will give you a place, a residence, a place to stay, a safe harbor.
Now, Michele, how often does it happen that a perpetrator of abuse serves their criminal sentence, finishes off whatever they were required to do, and then turns around and tries to get back to or gets back at their former victim?
It happens all the time. A lot of women and men are unable to get away from the situation. If I can't have you, nobody else can. And so it deals with sometimes mental illness when people are obsessed with one party or not. But then we move over into the other category of domestic violence known as stalking, where the perpetrator just can't move on. So they will follow the person. The person can move, they can try to change their identity, whatever. The perpetrator is just stuck on them. And so there are harsher penalties, and of course, felonious time is usually imposed for those type of perpetrators because they are very dangerous and will stop at nothing.
And going back to the victims, how often is it that they get the relief they need, the punishment is meted out to their victimizer, but when the person gets out, they're the ones seeking out the perpetrator?
That happens also. It's very common that a perpetrator will have a restraining order against them, and the victim calls them over and says, "Hey, come on over. Let's talk. Let's get back together. I miss you. I love you." I've literally have been in trial thinking I'm saving somebody from a horrible life of domestic violence, and they have gotten engaged over the lunch hour. But that's part of the cycle. You always hear them talk about the cycle of violence and the honeymoon phase and how a person will get reeled back in. "Oh, baby, I didn't mean to hurt you. It'll never happen again. Buy the flowers, the ring, the this, the that, the dress, the fancy dinner that, we never ever got to go on." And then all of a sudden, the person's back in and the violence erupts again. So unless people can break the cycle of violence and get the needed counseling, both the victim and the perpetrator need that counseling, because the victim needs to understand why they are so vulnerable and why they continually go back and get themselves in. If people don't understand that there's a mental component to all of it. And so there's a lot of counseling that needs to be had. I remember a trial I had involving domestic violence, and I remember the man killed the cat. And during our negotiations, I had asked for more time on the cat than I did the victim of domestic violence. Not being cruel to the victim, but I said, here is a animal that doesn't understand what's happening, cannot get up and leave, cannot call law enforcement. Yet we have another person who is situated in that situation, who can walk out the front door, who can call 911, who can get a restraining order, who can seek out help. But with that all being said, it is always not that easy for some people to do because of the psychological factors and fear of not being able to care for themselves and being left alone.
So, Michele, what happened with that case with the cat?
Well, the defendant was convicted, and he got 3 years for the cat and 2 weeks for the wife.
And how did the jury react to your asking for that specific punishment?
Well, the jury didn't necessarily know what I was asking, but I can tell you, during the testimony regarding this big man kicking this little innocent kitten to death, they all cried. It was overwhelming for everyone in the courtroom because they all understood that the cat could not leave and didn't understand. Whereas the victim could call 911, could get up, could leave. And I think my judge, that resonated with him in doing the sentencing.
I hate to admit it, but I was a little bit surprised at the empathy and the compassion that you bring to the prosecutorial side. Again, maybe it's my misconception, but the idea of a prosecutor is just someone who goes for justice and represents the state or the county or wherever they work. But you bring a great deal of humanity to the work you do.
Good, thank you.
Now, we always close out the show with paying attention to the messages or story in a song lyric. Today, I've chosen the lyrics to a song that I think addresses another aspect of domestic violence, and that is realizing or committing to leaving that toxic relationship once and for all. In doing so, my hope is that you finally feel strong and empowered enough to never return to it, no matter how much your abuser vows to change. Also, the songs I choose reference the importance of time in some way. Time needed, time spent, and most often, time wasted. Today, I picked pop hit Roar by Katy Perry. The lyrics imply that the singer was a victim of some kind of abuse, but was able to finally leave her abuser. There is one line in particular in that dynamic anthem. "You held me down, but I got up." Whether you resonate with it literally or figuratively, I'm sure it will have an impact on you. Now, if that song doesn't work for you, below is my short list of a handful of others to consider. Each of them contains lyrics that are summarized with a feeling of strength and empowerment, and hope. Rihanna's Cold Case Love, Pearl Jam's Rearview Mirror, Demi Lovato's Skyscraper, Sigrid's Don't Kill My Vibe, and Jimmy Cliff, I Can See Clearly Now. Any of these might get you singing loudly from the mountaintops, or in the shower. Remember this, no matter how down you've gotten, both mentally and physically, you can get up and get out. Within a short time, you will begin to live a better life. After all, isn't that what you really deserve?